I thought our 10-year anniversary was a celebration of true love, but a dusty diary from 2012 just proved my entire life is a lie. My wife didn't marry me because she loved me. She married me because I fit a checklist for financial stability, she wrote in high school. Every "I love you" was a scripted line in a decade-long performance. My name is Thomas. I'm 38. I work as an architect for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte. And for 10 years I'd been married to a woman I believed had chosen me the way I'd chosen her. Completely, for reasons that had nothing to do with a spreadsheet. I found the diary while looking for our anniversary photo albums, the ones Claire swore were somewhere in the attic crawlspace above the garage. It was in a shoebox behind a stack of her mother's old quilts, a plain composition notebook with "Private, Claire M." written across the cover in the careful, looping handwriting of a 17-year-old. I want to be honest that I almost didn't open it. 10 years of marriage builds a specific kind of respect for the sealed-off parts of a person's past, and some instinct told me this belonged in that category. I opened it anyway, thinking it might have prom photos, old notes from friends, the harmless artifacts of a childhood I'd always found endearing. The first several pages were exactly that. Ordinary teenage things, a crush on someone named Bradley, complaints about a chemistry teacher. Then I found the list, dated 3 weeks before her high school graduation, titled simply, "What I Actually Need, Not What I Want." 6 bullet points. Financial stability, first and specific. Someone who will never make me feel what Dad's unemployment felt like. Steady career, second. Someone who wouldn't leave, third, underlined twice. I sat on the dusty plywood floor of that attic for a long time. Our 10th anniversary 2 days away, holding a document written 11 years before we'd even met. That read less like a teenager's private hopes and more like a set of specifications I hadn't known I'd been quietly measured against for the entire length of our marriage. I closed the notebook and put it back exactly where I'd found it. I didn't say anything to Claire that night, or the next, or during the small, warm anniversary dinner she'd planned at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. I smiled through the toast. I told her I loved her and meant it. The way you can mean something and still feel the ground underneath it quietly shifting. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand until nearly 6 weeks later, was that the diary wasn't actually the worst thing sitting in that attic waiting for me to notice it, and that the real story of what my marriage had become was happening in real time, not 11 years in the past. For months before I found that shoebox, none of this would have registered as anything but the comfortable, unremarkable rhythm of a decade-long marriage, which, I understand now, is exactly what let the Real story hide in plain sight for as long as it did. Claire and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party when I was 28, married 2 years later, and built the kind of life that looked, from any reasonable outside angle, genuinely happy. A house in a good school district, 2 kids we both adored, a marriage that had weathered the ordinary strains of young parenthood without any single dramatic rupture. Claire had worked as a real estate agent for the better part of a decade, competent and well-regarded, and 8 months earlier had started taking on more listings for a new development firm run by a man named Bradley Whitfield, a name I recognized only vaguely as someone she'd dated briefly in high school, mentioned once, years ago, with the kind of easy nostalgia people use for harmless old history. I trusted Claire completely, in the specific, uncomplicated way you trust someone after a decade of ordinary life together. Not because I'd examined the trust and found it earned, but because examining it had simply never occurred to me as necessary. I built houses for a living, careful, deliberate structures, and somehow it never struck me as strange that I'd never once applied that same scrutiny to my own foundation. The first thing I noticed, without registering it as anything worth noticing, was that Claire's showings with the Whitfield development had grown more frequent that spring. Evening walkthroughs, weekend open houses, always described the same practical way, always framed around the size of the commission if the property sold well. I remember feeling, if anything, genuinely proud of how much business she was generating. She started keeping her phone charging in the bathroom overnight instead of the kitchen, a small habit shift I noticed the way you notice a chair moved a few inches from where it usually sits. Present, faintly odd, gone from my mind within the hour. She'd come home from Whitfield showings with a specific kind of energy I hadn't seen in her in years, and I remember being glad of it. The sense that her career was finally hitting the stride she'd always wanted. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a decade-long marriage once both people have stopped asking each other the real questions and started calling the silence stability instead. Maybe you know that kind of quiet. It doesn't arrive as conflict. It arrives as routine, comfortable enough that neither person notices the substitution until something forces them to look underneath it. I want to be honest about my own part in this, because it would be easy to tell this only as something that happened to me. I'd stopped asking Claire real questions about her day sometime around Ben's kindergarten year. Logistics, mostly, whose turn for pickup, whether a showing had gone well. I told myself that was simply the natural evolution of a decade together, the comfortable shorthand long marriages develop. I understand now it was also, quietly, a kind of absence I'd let grow without noticing its actual shape. The first crack I actually filed away, rather than let pass, came on a Tuesday in early spring, when Claire mentioned that Bradley had personally asked her to handle the marketing for his firm's flagship property. Practically a promotion, she said, with a specific warmth in how she said his name that registered, briefly, before I let it pass entirely. I asked, lightly, how well she'd known him back in high school. She said, not that well, really, just dated a few months, and moved the conversation along to Ben's school project. I let her move it. I didn't think about it again until 9 days later, when Grace, our 8-year-old, mentioned that Mr. Bradley had been at the house when she got home from school, a detail I noted and then, once again, let pass, filing it beside the phone charging in the bathroom and the warmth in Claire's voice. By April, I'd started keeping a private, half-acknowledged log I didn't admit to myself I was keeping, dates, described showings, small inconsistencies that meant nothing individually and something I wasn't ready to name collectively. Ben, 5, asked at dinner one night why Mommy's work friend had picked her up in the shiny car instead of her own, a detail so small and specific I almost didn't register what it implied. I asked Claire about it that evening. She said her car had been in the shop and Bradley had offered her a ride to a showing. Nothing more. It was, on its own, a completely reasonable answer. I filed it anyway, next to the promotion, next to the warmth in her voice. I traveled for a 3-day architecture conference in Atlanta in mid-April, and Claire texted normally each night. Updates about the kids, a funny thing Ben had said, nothing that read as anything but an ordinary marriage running its ordinary course. On the second night, at 9:50, I noticed her location, shared between our phones for years and mostly forgotten, placed her at an address in a part of town nowhere near any Whitfield property I recognized, nowhere near any restaurant we frequented. I stared at that small blue dot for a long time. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever watched a small blue dot on a screen quietly contradict everything your wife has told you that week, you already know the specific, cold stillness that settles into a hotel room 400 miles from home. It isn't rage yet. It's smaller than that. The sensation of a foundation you'd always assumed was solid revealing, very calmly, that it might not be. I didn't confront her over the phone. I told myself I needed the full shape of it before I said anything I couldn't take back, and I understand now that part of that patience was genuine strategy, and part of it was simple fear of an answer I still, on some level, hoped wouldn't come. She told me, much later, what that particular night had actually been. I told myself, sitting in his car outside that building, that this was the last time I'd let it go this far, that I'd go back to being exactly who I was supposed to be once this project wrapped. I remember texting you goodnight from the passenger seat, feeling something in me tear cleanly in half. Half of me wanted to be exactly where I was sitting. Half of me wanted to drive straight home and end it before it became something I couldn't undo. I did neither. I turned my phone face down in the cup holder and stayed anyway. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I only had a blue dot on a map and a growing unease I still hadn't let myself fully name. The subplot that mattered more than I understood came through my own sister, Denise, who mentioned at a family dinner in late April that she'd run into Claire and Bradley having lunch downtown. Looked like a nice business meeting, she said, unbothered, meaning nothing by it. I smiled and agreed, and the sentence sat with me for days afterward in a way I couldn't fully explain to myself at the time. I found the diary in the attic 11 days after that lunch, my anniversary 2 days away, and I want to be honest that discovering it didn't answer the questions I'd already started quietly assembling. It added an entirely new, colder question underneath them. One about what our entire 10 years had actually been built on, long before Bradley Whitfield's name had ever come back into either of our lives. I didn't confront Claire about the diary, and I didn't confront her about the blue dot in Atlanta either. That decision, more than any single piece of evidence, is the part of this I understand most clearly now. Looking back, I made a choice, sometime in that final week before our anniversary, to become a man who gathered quietly rather than reacted. And I've never fully settled whether that was wisdom or simply another form of the same conflict avoidance that had let a decade of comfortable silence go unquestioned in the first place. I started, methodically, the way I'd approach reviewing a building's structural integrity, verifiable pieces rather than suspicion alone. I checked, quietly, the credit card statement I still had access to, and found 2 charges at a boutique hotel in the part of town where that blue dot had placed her, dated the Atlanta conference nights. Small amounts that read as valet parking or a bar tab rather than a room itself, but present, undeniable, exactly where they shouldn't have been. Denise's comment about the downtown lunch resurfaced with new weight once I had that statement in hand. No longer a harmless business meeting, but one visible point in a pattern I could now trace with real confidence. I found, in the first week of May, a text preview flash across Claire's phone screen while it charged, uncharacteristically, in the kitchen one evening. A single line from a contact saved simply as B. Something about counting down to Thursday. Gone before I could read more, but specific enough to end, permanently, whatever benefit of the doubt I'd still been quietly extending. Grace's comment about Mr. Bradley being at the house resurfaced that same week, no longer an isolated oddity, but a clear point in a pattern spanning at least 4 months. Ben's comment about the shiny car took its place beside it. By the second week of May, I had what I needed: the 2 hotel charges, the text preview, Denise's independent account of the lunch, a pattern of at least 4 months, likely longer. I didn't feel triumphant assembling it. I felt something closer to grief arriving early, compounded by a second, colder grief underneath it. The diary, still sitting exactly where I'd left it in that shoebox, its own separate question about whether any part of the last decade had been what I believed it was. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is harder to say plainly than the affair itself. I could have confronted Claire the night I found that diary. I chose instead to keep gathering, quietly, for nearly 6 weeks, and I've asked myself since whether that was patience or simply the same avoidance that had let a decade of not asking real questions pass without much scrutiny at all. I think it was some of both. I wanted the entire, undeniable shape of both things, the affair and whatever the diary actually meant, before I let her see that I knew any of it, not to punish her with the waiting, but because I needed, for my own sake, to stop being the last person in my own marriage who didn't understand what it had actually been built on. I told no one what I'd found, not Denise, not my closest friend from architecture school, until every piece was organized clearly enough that there would be no room left for the kind of soft, partial explanation I suspected, correctly, Claire was fully capable of constructing under pressure. I chose a Saturday afternoon, deliberately, when the kids were at a birthday party and the house was fully, uninterruptedly quiet. I laid everything on the dining room table before Claire came in from the garage, the credit card statement, printed, a simple typed timeline, and, at the center of it, the shoebox itself, the diary open to the page with the list. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the shoebox specifically, and I watched something in her posture go very still, the particular stillness of someone confronting not one exposed secret, but 2 at once, neither of which she'd had time to prepare an answer for. "Sit down," I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd had 6 weeks to make sure of that. "I want you to look at what's on this table. All of it. And then I want the truth, not whatever gets us through this afternoon." She sat and looked at the diary for a long, silent moment before she could bring herself to look at the credit card statement beside it, and I watched her attempt, visibly, to find an angle into either one that could survive contact with the specific, dated evidence in front of her. "That was written when I was 17, she said finally, nodding at the diary, her voice smaller than I'd expected. "That's not. I didn't marry you off some list I wrote as a teenager. That's not fair. I'm not asking about the list right now," I said, though I could hear, even as I said it, how much the list had already reframed everything else on that table. "I'm asking about Bradley. Hotel charges in May. A text from B. About counting down to Thursday. Denise saw you too at lunch downtown. How long? She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched whatever composure she'd walked in with simply run out of road. Since February, she said. It started at the first walkthrough for his flagship property. I let that sit in the room. I need to hear the rest, I said. All of it. And then I need you to explain that diary, because right now I don't know which version of the last 10 years I'm actually supposed to believe. She began, quiet now, no longer trying to manage the shape of what she was telling me. Seeing him again at that first walkthrough, it wasn't planned, and it wasn't calculated the way that list up there is going to make you think everything about us was. He remembered things about who I was at 17 that even I'd half forgotten. It felt, for about 20 minutes that first day, like being handed back a version of myself I thought I'd left behind entirely. I told myself it was nothing. Then it was coffee after showings. Then it was more than coffee, and every single time I told myself it was the last time, and I believed it a little less each time and kept saying it anyway, because admitting I didn't believe it meant admitting what I'd actually let myself become. I was scared constantly, not just of this exact afternoon, though obviously that most of all, but of what it said about me that I could be with him in the afternoon and then help Grace with her homework that same evening and feel almost nothing bridging the two versions of myself. I stopped being able to look at our wedding photo in the hallway some mornings. I'd walk past it fast on purpose. She stopped and looked, finally, directly at the diary. I need you to actually hear this part, because I think it matters more than you realize right now. That list wasn't the reason I married you. I wrote that when Dad had just lost his job for the third time, and we almost lost the house, and I was 17 and terrified in a way you've never had to be terrified. But by the time I actually met you, years later, I wasn't checking boxes anymore. I loved you. I still believe that's true, even sitting here right now, even after everything I've done to make you doubt it. Bradley didn't happen because you failed some test from that list. He happened because he reminded me of a version of myself from before I ever needed a list at all, and I didn't have the strength to walk away from that feeling when I found it again. I didn't answer for a long moment. Something in me understood, even furious, even grieving two betrayals at once at my own dining room table, that both things could be true, that the list had been real and had genuinely shaped a 17-year-old's fear, and that it didn't fully explain or excuse 10 years of a marriage I'd trusted completely without ever once checking whether that trust was warranted. I need you to leave the house, I said finally. Tonight. I'm not doing this in stages anymore. She didn't argue. I think some part of her had been braced for exactly that sentence since the moment she'd seen the shoebox on the table. Claire moved into a short-term rental across town that same night. The divorce process began within the month, and I want to be honest that I didn't approach it gently. Whatever grace I might have extended to a single mistake, 10 years of unexamined trust, and a diary that had quietly reframed the foundation of my entire adult life, left very little appetite in me for generosity at the negotiating table. The Fuller account, the one she'd promised still mattered more than I understood, came 6 weeks later, in a conversation she asked for specifically, sitting across from me at a coffee shop rather than our old dining room table. I need to tell you the actual shape of this, she said, because I don't think you have it yet, and you deserve it even though it changes nothing about what happens next. That checklist wasn't really about you, and it was never really about money either, not underneath it. It was about never again feeling the specific fear of watching my father pack a U-Haul at 2 in the morning because we couldn't make rent. I was 17, and I promised myself I'd never let a man's instability do that to my own kids someday. By the time I actually met you, that fear had mostly folded itself into the person I'd become. I wasn't scanning you against 6 bullet points in a notebook. I loved the specific way you talked about buildings like they were living things. I loved how patient you were with Grace's tantrums when she was 2. None of that was performance. What happened with Bradley wasn't me finally settling a score from that old list. If anything, it terrified me precisely because it had nothing to do with financial stability at all. He's not more stable than you. Not really. It was about being seen, suddenly, as the 17-year-old who'd wanted things beyond safety, recklessness, adventure, a version of a future that didn't just mean surviving. I mistook that resurfaced feeling for something worth risking everything over, and I understand now, sitting here, that it wasn't. It was just old and unfinished, and I let it become new again instead of leaving it in that shoebox where it belonged. I asked her, before we left that coffee shop, whether she'd ever really loved me, given everything the diary had made me doubt. She said yes, without hesitation, and then added, quieter, that loving me and being afraid enough at 17 to write that list had simply both been true at once, two separate facts about her life that had nothing to do with each other until I'd found them in the same shoebox on the same afternoon and let them collapse into a single, devastating story. Bradley Whitfield's development firm lost its exclusive marketing arrangement with Claire's brokerage within 2 months. Once his own business partner learned the specifics of what had actually been happening during those flagship property walkthroughs, a specific, visible cost, though I never learned much beyond that, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't especially need to. The divorce finalized that autumn. I kept the house, kept the majority of what we'd built financially across a decade, and Claire moved into a smaller place with considerably less than she'd walked into the marriage with, not out of vengeance on my part, but because a decade of unexamined trust, once actually examined by a lawyer, entitled me to more than I'd ever thought to ask for while the marriage was still standing. I kept the diary, oddly enough. I couldn't say exactly why for a long time. I think, eventually, I understood it wasn't really evidence of a lie at all. It was evidence of a frightened 17-year-old who'd grown into someone more complicated than any single list could hold. Someone capable of real love and real betrayal in the same decade, sometimes nearly the same year. I could have stayed angry through that whole autumn. I chose, somewhere around December, not to. That was the only kind of winning that ever actually mattered to me. I started sleeping through the night again sometime that winter, and I noticed it specifically. Not gradually, but as an actual morning where I woke and realized the low, constant static I'd carried since that dusty attic afternoon simply wasn't there anymore. I hadn't announced it to anyone. I just noticed, one ordinary Tuesday, that the weight was gone. I'm not the same man who sat cross-legged on a plywood attic floor 2 days before his 10th anniversary, holding a stranger's fears written in his own wife's handwriting. I'm quieter now, in a way that feels earned instead of avoidant. I ask more questions now, of everyone I let close, about the parts of them that live underneath the comfortable shorthand, not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to respect for how much of a person a decade of marriage can still leave completely unexamined if you let it. The most painful contradiction in this story isn't the affair, it's that the diary, the thing that seemed to prove the entire marriage had been a calculated performance, turned out to be both real and largely beside the point. Claire's fear at 17 was genuine, and it genuinely shaped who she became. It simply stopped being the operative force in her choices long before she and Thomas ever met. The tragedy is that Thomas found the diary and the affair within the same 6 weeks, and the two discoveries fused into a single, more devastating story than either one told on its own actually supported. Thomas's decade of complete, unexamined trust deserves scrutiny beyond simple sympathy. His instinct to never check, never ask the harder questions underneath the comfortable logistics of a long marriage, wasn't neutral. It was its own quiet form of avoidance, one that let both a stranger's old fears and a present-day betrayal go unnoticed until circumstance, rather than attentiveness, forced them into view. An architect who spends his working life scrutinizing foundations had simply never turned that same scrutiny toward his own. Claire's account of what Bradley actually represented, not more stability, but a resurfaced version of herself who'd wanted more than safety, reframes the affair away from the simpler, more punishing reading the diary initially seemed to demand. She didn't return to Bradley to finally collect on some teenage financial checklist. She returned to something entirely different and, in its own way, more dangerous, an old, unfinished part of herself she mistook for permission to blow up something real. The actual point of no return wasn't the first walkthrough at the flagship property. It was the moment Claire began treating a decade of genuine love as though it required no ongoing tending. The same unexamined comfort Thomas extended to his own trust, mirrored back in her own quiet drift towards someone who made her feel newly seen. Two people, both coasting on old decisions instead of active ones, arrived at the same collapse from two different directions.